Welcome everyone at the Kunsthalle Wien for another talk of the within the L'Exposition Imaginaire exhibition project. And tonight I'm very happy to have with us, even virtually, unfortunately only virtually, Erika Balsom, and who already collaborated with the Kunsthalle for the exhibition Kidnapper's Foil by Gareth Long. And Erika, she's lecturer in film studies and liberal arts at King's College in London. And she's the author of a very interesting book titled Exhibiting Cinema in Contemporary Art, where she confronts the changing contours of what we call cinema in the digital realm through an examination of uses of the moving image and references to film history in art since 1990. And she's the co-editor of the anthology Documentary Across Disciplines. And her next book, which is titled After Uniqueness, A History of Film and Video Art in Circulation, is forthcoming from Columbia University Press next year, right? And tonight, Erika, she will give a presentation which looks at how the reproducibility of film and video as figure as both promise and threat. And with a title, the provisional title, at least was a few weeks ago, The Ambivalence of the Copy. So, thanks to be here with us, Erika, and please, we can start.
Thanks. I've never given a lecture over Skype before, so let me know if at any point you can't hear me or I'm not sure.
I will let you know.
This is a talk that comes from the book After Uniqueness, which tries to look at the implications of the reproducibility of film and video when they enter into an art system that's largely founded upon authenticity and uniqueness. So I'll start with a small example. When viewers purchased a ticket for Philippe Perrinot's exhibition at the Palais de Tokyo in 2013, when you walked up to the ticket counter, bought your ticket, you were asked to take away an unlabeled DVD in a blank plastic case. And in the exhibition guide, it explained what this DVD was. It said it was an artwork called Precognition from 2012. And on it, it contained videos, two of the videos that were on display in the exhibition, Marilyn and CHZ. And so there was a sense that taking this DVD allowed the viewer to continue the experience of viewing the exhibition after leaving the Palais de Tokyo. So you can say maybe that the artist is playing with the spatiotemporal limits of the exhibition and enabling the images within the exhibition to travel between the large-scale public projection happening at the Palais de Tokyo and then all of the smaller screens of domestic circulation that they would appear on when people took them home and played them. So Perrinot was using the possibilities of digitization to distribute all of these cheaply produced copies of the work. And it was quite important, I think, that the versions of these videos on the DVD were just slightly different than the ones being shown in the show. They had different soundtracks. So the image track was the same, the soundtrack was different. So they kind of replayed this tendency for digital media artifacts to exist in multiple versions that can kind of transform as they move across different display platforms.
Which was not the DVD, which I remember, I think was Pierre Wig that once, or it was the same Perrinot that a few years ago released this film on DVDs which expire after like 3 times, right?
That's it. So this is what, you've given away the punchline of my
Okay, sorry,
of my
because
story.
I remember I bought one in a store in Paris a few years ago, but this was before the exhibition, the Palais de Tokyo, right?
He's done it a couple times, yeah. So he also did it with The Boy from Mars at the Frederick Petzel Gallery a few years before that. But I think in kind of using this format, there's a sense that Pereno is thinking about the reproducibility of video as a medium. And I think that often when we're talking about film and video, reproducibility can be understood in two different ways. It's often understood in the sense that the image reproduces reality, right? It produces a copy of physical reality. And that's one understanding of reproducibility, and it's one that I think gets discussed a lot. But there's another way of thinking about reproducibility, and that has to do with the idea that film and video exist in an economy of the multiple, right? So we have many, many copies that can be produced of a single thing. And this is this aspect of reproducibility, I think, gets discussed less than the idea that film and video copy the real. And so what I was interested in doing with this project, and I think what Pereno was interested in doing with kind of giving out these DVDs, was somehow asking us to think about this idea of film and video as arts of the multiple. And as you said, there's a sense that this is a work that's invested in circulation and abundance, but it's also marked by extreme limitation. Because in the exhibition guide, it said that the DVD would erase itself after being shown only once. And this is something William Gibson did in the early 90s, in like 1992. He produced this book called Agrippa, A Book of the Dead, and it was fabricated to be read only once so that the paper, the dye in the paper would start to become invisible after exposed to air. And there's a sense that this disposable DVD format is doing something like that for the moving image. And this was a real format that was, meant to be the new way that people would rent movies. And the motivation behind it was to limit piracy. So the idea was that you could rent the DVD and then it would last up to 2 days before it was made unplayable. And so Pereno uses this technology, which of course was a complete failure for all kinds of reasons. It's like environmentally, it's very unfriendly to be producing tons of disposable DVDs. And so it never really caught on as an industrial technology, especially because it was proposed right before streaming became like an actual possibility for things like Netflix. So he revives this format, which is at once about an extreme scarcity and a kind of free circulation. So it's this kind of contradictory format. And I think that it's quite an interesting gesture because it really condenses these two ways of thinking about video that exist in the art world today, right? One is that it's reproducible. It can circulate very widely. It can be disseminated online. And the other, of course, is that no, this is art, and art depends upon rarity, right? Whether for market reasons or otherwise, there's this real investment in keeping a hold of artworks and making sure that they are, quote unquote, authentic. And in the case of the moving image, that often happens through the limited edition model of sale. And so I think that there's a sense that this is an artwork that makes us think about how the copy and how reproducibility offer both a promise and a threat. So on the one hand, the promise is the promise of democratization and access and circulation. But on the other hand, there's a threat of uncontrolled circulation beyond desirable contexts, or of not being able to ensure the authenticity of the work, if that's important to you. So I think it's interesting to kind of reread the history of the moving image in art through this lens of reproducibility as a promise and a threat. Because there's a long, long history of really valuing the reproducibility of the moving image. But on the other hand, art remains very tied to uniqueness. And today we have kind of the most controlled form of distribution in the history of cinema and in the history of art, which is the limited edition, existing alongside the most promiscuous form of distribution in those same histories, which is the BitTorrent tracker. So there's a sense that digitization has really unleashed all of these new modes of image circulation, but they also make us kind of think differently about all of those modes of circulation that had existed prior to them. You can interrupt me at any time. It's really strange to be sitting alone in my office.
Yeah. Without watching
yeah,
like
exactly,
the audience.
exactly.
But,
so
I was curious to know when the market of the limited edition actually developed, because I think like the first galleries, at least, like were people interested in producing like videos were Castelli and Sonnabend, if I'm not wrong, and also in Florence there was what's the name,
Art Tapes 22.
Art Tapes 22,
Yeah.
and but so it started in that period, or?
I mean, it depends on how you think about it. So there are actually attempts to sell film as early as 1930. So Julian Levy, who was a New York gallerist who represented the Surrealists primarily, he had this plan that he wanted to sell limited edition films of things like Ballet Mécanique and the films of the historical avant-garde. And he hoped that by selling them as artworks, he could encourage more artists to make films. But this was a sort of idea that he had, but it never ended up being put into practice. Then in the 50s, Bruce Conner proposed a sort of similar idea to his gallerist Charles Allen around 1957. So it was a year before he even made his first film. He was already thinking like, how can I sell this as an art object? But you're absolutely right that the first sort of, I can't even call it a successful attempt because Castelli Sonnabend was not a successful venture, but the first even taste of maybe an official putting into action of a plan to do this happened both with Castelli Sonnabend in New York and also with Jerry Schum's video gallery in Dusseldorf. So those are the two kind of first real attempts to make it happen, but neither one of them really succeeded. And it isn't until the early 90s that we actually get something approaching a greater market viability of the limited edition. And there are all kinds of factors as to why that happens. Some of them have to do with the art market crashing at the end of the 80s. But I would say that the primary factor would be the embrace of large-scale projection happening in the late 80s and early 90s, because there's a sense that institutional endorsement came first, and then the market followed later. Because with large-scale projection, there was a sense that works could claim more space in the gallery, they could be more cinematic, installation-based. I mean, all of the things that we know that happened with the moving image in the 90s also ended up being closely tied to the way that a market developed for it.
But in the case of Paranoia, I was thinking that actually the idea that the DVD expired created a counter effect of
it's scarcity. You know, it creates rarity.
Yeah, that you don't want to actually watch it. You want to keep it as a fetish.
Like a perfect, object.
So it creates I'm sure a lot of people never open the DVD to watch it. Keep it as a kind of unsigned, open multiple, which is also interesting. Like
That's
this
super
counter
interesting.
effect.
I hadn't thought of that because, of course, when I got mine, I immediately wanted to see how this technology worked of this disc that would,
I
erase.
told you this because I did the opposite.
Ah. I mean, I immediately played mine, but the very interesting thing is that this format, it's called a DVD-D, like destructible DVD. This format was meant to combat piracy, right? So the format itself is meant to be a way of asserting control over the circulation of images. But of course, it completely failed because it's very easy to copy these discs. And so I immediately put mine in my computer, dragged and dropped the files, and I made a bootleg of this disc. And I mean, that's a kind of personal anecdote, but I also think it tells us something really important about the relationship between rarity and reproducibility. These are not just kind of opposed terms, but they're actually really in a dialectical tension with each other. They produce one another. So if something is rare, there's a desire to see it, and so people produce bootlegs and try and circulate it, right? As I did with this Perino disc. But if we then live, as we do, in a visual culture that is absolutely flooded with images, there's, I think, a kind of increased desire for forms of experience and forms of art that do not participate in that regime of circulation, copying, etc. And I think that if you think about how 16 millimeter became a kind of fetish in art in the last 2 decades, that's partially what's happening. If you think about the turn to performance and dance in the last 10 years or so, someone like Tino Segal refuses to allow any documentation of his work, even his sales contract. And so I think there's this sense that, when everything can be copied and when everything seems to be available online or circulating online, we get the kind of emergence of these practices that are about asserting an opposition to reproducibility, right? That insist on being seen in a kind of live situation or in some kind of singular event that resists copying.
Sorry, you wanted to continue, or because I can interrupt you every second, so.
Yeah, no, maybe it's just better if we.
No, please continue because I can then collect my questions or interruptions. Up to you.
Okay.
Or you wanted to, I don't know.
No, I can continue. That's fine. I guess one of the things I'm interested in thinking about is how the moving image enters art really as a challenge to the unique work of art, right? And there's a sense that it is a kind of small utopia. This is a term that Germano Chilant has come up with to refer to this desire for the unlimited fabrication and widespread distribution of art objects. So this kind of dream that emerges in the early 20th century, and that actually is a way of telling a kind of different history of art across the 20th century, to think not about masterworks, but to think about practices that are invested in access, practices that are invested in changing the situations in which we encounter art. And he says that the kind of apotheosis of this small utopia is with the vogue for sculptural multiples in the 1960s. And I think that's completely fair. But I also think that the moving image, especially the institutions that developed to support it in the post-war period, offers another really important context for thinking about this proposition, especially since the moving image evades those kind of petit bourgeois fantasies of ownership that still accompany sculptural multiples, right? Though that's still a kind of object-based practice. that we don't have with the moving image. And so I think it's interesting to think about what happens to that as time goes on. Because I think on the one hand, we can say that it absolutely persists. And there are lots of artists who are interested in kind of making use of these possibilities of digital circulation that we have today. But on the other hand, we see lots of attempts to kind of push back against it and reassert the necessity of a kind of controlled image. And that can come out of financial motivations, but not only. There are all kinds of conceptual motivations and aesthetic motivations for wanting to create a kind of unique object or a unique experience.
Yeah, I was thinking also about the work as The Clock by Christian Marclay, which in a way a key element of that work is time, right? And so thinking about, and the fact that of course any institutions or like galleries who, I mean galleries only once because it was White Cube, I think, decided to present, to exhibit the work, had to like have like the space open 24 hours, which also creates a kind of feedback problem in the sense that if you, as an individual collector, also acquire the piece, in a way, you have always to make the work happening, also to like, in a way, present it always in 24 hours, which I think is something will never happen in a kind of private situation. And I think a lot of questions arises, especially with also the what happened, especially with like video works or film works when are acquired, like are bought by private collectors. Also, what's the life, the aftermath of these works. I always thought about how these kind of collectors, like, what kind of experience they have of this, because honestly, I think in 90% of the time is more about acquiring a film as an object at the end, in a metaphorical way. So especially like, and that's why certain artists start to produce a kind of special edition, trying to make it as precious as possible. Like Matthew Barney, for example, if I'm not wrong, like the cremaster thing is also like in a box, trying to add as much elements as possible to give a reason to a collector to spend $200,000 or even more.
Yeah. It is really interesting. I mean, because the clock actually, I mean, I think when collectors buy films or videos, they might want to buy an object, but what they're actually buying is a series of rights and permissions about being able to show that work and archive that work over time. And the clock is actually a great example of that because, because the price was so high and the demand was so high, some institutions partnered together to co-acquire the work. And so in the case of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the National Gallery of Canada, they co-acquired the work and they both acquired the hardware, but only one of them was allowed to show it at any given time. That's right? So you can see that it's actually not about the object, it's about rights and permissions. But you're absolutely right that I think especially in the 90s, there was this kind of idea that it's not enough to buy a video, it has to be a video in like a pine box. Or Matthew Barney has, really deluxe kind of sculptural objects that contain the Cremaster series. And I believe in the Barney editions, one of them was issued on Laserdisc, completely obsolete format. Another one was a DVD inside this like super sculptural box. Those are not archival formats. So it's quite interesting to think about, what you're getting and how that will last in terms of like safekeeping for the long run.
Also because are connected to, like, are made of tools which are in the collective imaginary related to the idea of endless reproducibility. As a DVD, as an audio file, that's why you immediately try to, okay, I can copy it. It's a kind of a natural instinct. And that's why it's also so weird for when you talk with people outside the artwork, to explain that you have, apart from institutions, which makes sense, but individual kind of collectors that can spend tons of money to buy actually a DVD. But as you said, the idea is again to buy like a fetish, to acquire kind of the right that the thing is yours, but at the same time, you don't have, it is not always true, because then the video can screen and present in several museums. So it's not even like that they have to kind of do a loan request to you. Sometimes.
Exactly.
So that I think these are kind of very. It seems that we are talking about very kind of about details, but especially. A lot of things, a lot of issues related to what we are discussing are very relevant and arise, especially when you go very like in depth and explore these details. I think, and I was curious to know about platforms of distributions, or not even distributions, or platforms like Vidrom or Ubu, which of course are very different, because Vidrom it's always like presenting, but just for a very limited period of time, and asking like the artist like the permission to do it,
but not paying them.
Not paying them. Because I was talking last week, actually, no, last Saturday with Stefano Czernuski from Mus, asking him if there was any artist who refused.
There have been.
To have been. There have been few, not so many, but I was curious to know like the reasons, and not like, I mean, was curious to know if there were certain artists were against the idea of presenting a work which were not conceived to be experienced in that kind of platform, in that way.
Yeah, so I, as a part of this research for this book, I was interested in looking at things like Vidrom as kind of like an inheritor of this earlier legacy of like showing video art and experimental film on television, right? Because you have these programs like Screening Room in Boston, Midnight Underground in the 11th Hour that came on the Channel 4 in the UK in the 70s and then in the 80s. And these were kind of programs that would come on late at night that would show experimental work. And on the one hand, this was like a wide access. But on the other hand, there's this temporal scarcity. It's broadcast and then it's gone. Of course, you could tape it off of the air with a VCR, but technically it's broadcast television, it's ephemeral. And so I thought that this limited temporality of Vidrom was kind of recalling this earlier model. So I started sort of doing some research on Vidrom, and it's quite interesting because apparently there have been, as you said, not very many, but some quite prominent artists who have refused to show work exactly because they don't want it circulating online. And And I think even maybe more importantly than that, Filipa Ramos, who's one of the curators involved with Vidrome, said that this limited window, which is, I think normally it's 10 days or 2 weeks or something, this window is absolutely crucial, because she said if we didn't have that, no one would agree.
Yeah, for sure.
And so it's only because of this limited time that people will agree to put it online. Whereas something like UbuWeb has an archive that's there and fine. And many people, to kind of bring up the title of your show, many people have kind of compared Ubu to André Malraux's Musée Imaginaire. And it's quite an interesting comparison, because I think you can absolutely see why someone would propose this, right? So you have works in kind of strange juxtapositions with one another, in a kind of lower quality reproduction, privileging access over quality. And I totally get that. But it's interesting, one of the peer reviewers of my book said, think about this comparison more. Actually, if you go back and you read the introduction in Malraux's Complete Works, which is like a new edition with an introduction from like a contemporary French scholar, she actually discusses that at the time, the Musée Imaginaire, the book, had like the highest possible quality reproductions. So it was actually, and that was something that when the book came out, people really remarked upon that. It was very unusual at the time that a book like this would have reproductions that were of such a high quality. And there was, of course, a kind of contextual and pedagogical function performed by their placement. It was very thought out, which images would be placed where, and the text that would go around them. And those, of course, are things that are nowhere happening on UbuWeb. So I do think it's an interesting.
Does Ubu ask like permissions?
No.
Most of the time,
and they pride themselves. Kenneth Goldsmith says, if we had to ask permission, UbuWeb would not exist. Yeah. It would be impossible. And so there is on the website, there's a document somewhere that talks about how they will not post anything that they say is in print. But if something is out of print or it's very expensive to procure, then they'll post it. But in fact, that's not quite true. Like, there are things on there that are available, but that are posted nonetheless. But it's interesting. I think when UbuWeb first began, it was much more controversial, especially in the experimental film community, because it's a community that has historically been very invested in medium specificity. So film on film, film about film, and also very invested in the moral rights of the filmmaker, right? So a filmmaker is thought to really to have control over where his work is shown or her work is shown is thought to be a really important thing in that community. And UbuWeb came along, put up all this stuff without asking permission, bad quality video. And there were a lot of discussions, especially on this one email list called Frameworks, that really saw UbuWeb as a big problem.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. But that's kind of changed. I think that's really changed. And over the years, UbuWeb has gotten a little bit more official. I mean, they used to have this thing called the Hall of Shame, where if an artist asked for a work to be taken down, they would be put in the Hall of Shame and kind of called out for being ungenerous in the circulation of their intellectual property. And that's gone now, and it has been gone for quite a long time. And now you have organizations like Electronic Arts Intermix or Lux partnering with UbuWeb to make things available officially through them. So it's quite interesting, because I think it has kind of changed over time from something that made a lot of people angry to something that now I think people really accepted, and most people acknowledge that it is a really amazing resource.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking about now very often, most of the times we consider that with the new development of technology and the fact that more and more works can be reproduced, and the idea of the documentation or like of reproduction then affect the aura of the piece, no? Preventing then people from being curious also to go and see the real work. And but on the other hand, I was reading that for example, a museum like Louvre, which allows the visitors to take pictures of it. Instead, I mean, actually is a sort of advertising to go. People feel instead, in that case, instead of affecting the aura in a negative way, in a way it enhances the aura of the work. So you like looking at it on the totally opposite point of view, which could be interesting to reflect, even if for films and moving images,
It's a different question.
Is a different question. I think if you watch a film of Kenneth Anger, so kind of a film or short film or experimental film on Ubu, most of the people they really think, okay, I got it. What's next? With kind of with a painting or installation, I think it's a different issue. So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that the situation that you described at the Louvre is completely true. And it's something I think that Walter Benjamin already knew, right? I mean, he's famous for saying that the aura withers in the age of mechanical reproduction. And that is the sort of, famous statement. But if you look more closely at some of the different versions of that essay, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, he says things that show that he knows that actually mechanical reproduction can also create a desire for authenticity and a desire to see the original work. So he has a footnote where he talks about a Madonna that at the time of its creation in like the 15th century would not have been considered an authentic work of art. But he says it becomes so later with the passage of time, especially in the 19th century. Okay, why especially in the 19th century? Well, that's when we have this huge proliferation of technologies of reproduction. So I really think it is this kind of dialectical movement whereby new technologies of reproduction and circulation both kind of destroy aura, but also create it in turn. But as you said, with film and video, it's kind of tricky because I think there's less of an acknowledgement of, I guess, what we could call primary and secondary viewing contexts. Right, so when someone sees something online, they think, yeah, I saw it, even though, maybe that's a secondary viewing context and it's not the work as it's really meant to be seen. And that question of, how the work is meant to be seen, that can be answered differently for various works. I mean, if you're talking about a Paul Sherritt's film, that's a Flickr film, it kind of has to be seen on film because there's a sense that that's a work that is about the film strip itself and the sense that the film strip is broken down into individual frames. But if you're watching a Kenneth Anger film, Does it have to be on celluloid? I don't think so. You know, maybe that's not a very purist, cinephile position for me to take, but I would say if you're seeing a great quality digital transfer of a Kenneth Anger film projected large in a cinema, you know, for me, obviously it's nicer to see a print, but I don't know that there's that necessary relationship to the material support in a film like Scorpio Rising, you know, whereas other films, I think we would say it's very, very important. So I think it's a case-by-case question, but it is something that I would say that viewers and curators and everyone has to pay more attention to.
Yeah, and regarding this, which is something you discuss, I think, quite in depth. I mean, in the book of exhibiting cinema in contemporary art, I found on the internet. I don't know if it was a text by or an interview with Alexander Orvat, which of course appears often in your, I can imagine, research, and as we know, is the director here in Vienna of the Film Museum, and his position is quite radical about that. And I wanted just to read this excerpt from this conversation that maybe you might know, but I think for the audience could be interesting to know how radical his position and the questions which can arise from that. And so he say, I consider much of what the artwork takes for granted when dealing with moving images to be highly unproductive and directed against the works themselves. The film medium has a very long, independent history in its relationship to the art world. Many art curators today attempt to set an accent by presenting film outside the cinema, considering this to be a progressive and critical stance in itself. However, in the first place, with the contemporary omnipresence of filmic images in the public space, there is nothing progressive about this anymore at all. Secondly, cinema itself brought about the expanded cinema as early as the 60s. There are intrinsic qualities of the medium that are related to a specific space and time constellation. Curators frequently build spaces designed for strolling. However, many works are designed to be experienced as a time-limited event with a start and a finish. You sometimes hear the old theory that the viewer is a freer and more autonomous subject when he can walk around the filmic installation and return to it at will, as opposed to when he goes to the cinema. I consider this to be a childish point of view. The reception mode of strolling past moving images in an art setting has more in common with strolling through a shopping mall. The next question would be that of the art market and the manner in which it deals with, from its perspective, difficult objects such as film. The art market is forced to turn films into editions. It has to subject film to certain practices that make it object-like and sellable. There is something, so to speak, unsellable that resides in film, an immateriality that also constitutes its utopian element, which is kind of statement and kind of very precise about a position which then in the book, in your book, there are these two, an example about the exhibition was organized at the MoMA PS1 of Berlin Alexanderplatz by Fassbinder, going back to the poster you have on your back, which is exactly about the experience, like strolling, so you can watch each kind of chapter, like going enter and exit, like that way, which is the typical way contemporary art, the typical contemporary art fruition of things, which of course exists and is like a belief for many artists. But I think it's very right, Orvat, because he, of course, he's talking about works which were not conceived to be experienced like that, which makes like a crucial difference. So many often we can see in exhibitions like films projected in a very cheap way, or films, and I mean, it's a very kind of radical position, but I think it's pretty. Sometimes the artwork tend to be very superficial when talking about other kind of um, sort of mediums or languages as
Yeah.
films, dance, and theaters, because then we go also we can talk like a lot about the the trend now of the last 10 years of presenting like theater then piece within in the exhibition spaces or museum, the fact that all the new museums like the Whitney, the Tate Modern, um, um, open up spaces devoted to that. But even now, the, these spaces are always like kind of a dot in terms of space and of investment compared to the rest.
I always have the sense that it's more about including that work on a checklist than it is about showing it properly, right? So like last year's Venice Biennial, the presentation of Alexander Kluge and Harun Farokhi both, I mean, it was really nightmarish. The Farokhi work, there were like a grid of small screens with all of his films presented silently. And then there was one film that would rotate every week, presented in a room. You know, it was fine, but whatever. But there was really a sense that that is a gesture to say, see, we included Harun Farokhi, not a way of actually presenting his work in a manner that would allow it to be seen and appreciated. And I think, I mean, the quote that you read from Alexander Horvath, it is an extreme position, but I agree with absolutely everything that he said in that quote. I would second it 100%. I think that this idea that the movie theater space or the cinema space has to be escaped is very misguided. I mean, what he talked about as this belief that it's somehow progressive to break out of the cinema, I think is still quite pervasive. And there's always this kind of cliche that gets repeated, which is that the cinema has a passive spectator. And I understand exactly where this thought comes from, and it has a very particular position within film theory in the 1970s. However, there are lots of other ways of thinking about spectatorship in cinema, and I don't think there's anything necessarily passive about watching a movie. Sure, you're sitting down, but I mean, physical passivity doesn't necessarily mean a lack of criticality or a lack of mental activity. So I really wonder, like, when people are just going to give up on this idea that the cinema is somehow a space of passivity. I mean, in a way, I think it's the space that most allows us a kind of concentrated experience of attention and engagement. Especially for works, you know, that are made for that space, it seems really important to encounter them within that space.
I think is also the fault of the artist, then, in the sense that the desire to distribute and to make and to share something with as many people as possible prevented them from being very kind of keeping a radical position, which is not even radical, but being like, this work has to be shown like that. But the problem is that sometimes this means that it's pretty expensive then to present that work, and the artist is aware of that, and so sometimes, you know, it's more flexible, accepting thing, because you know that the alternative is maybe is having that exhibition space refusing to show that work. And so this is again a kind of a practical thing, which is like happening like very, very often, and is also like the problem, or if we want to call it a problem, but when you talk with many of the artists who then decide to do like feature films, and with the idea of also addressing a different audience, which is, and so having their film circulated in movie theaters, then of course sometimes they're a bit naive, pretending that a film can really then trespass the threshold which divides like the circulation of in only like museum or art spaces and like the real the official movie theaters. Then it seems that okay, we didn't manage to do it, so then go to the option B, so we can present it like a classical video work, which is of course that there is the big issue of the distribution, because then these feature films, apart from a few examples, then as the same circulation of kind of small production feature films, or instead, I mean, this is connected to the production and who is distributing the movie, and so that is another story. But I think also this is again is a lack of awareness of also how the world is, and yeah, I don't know if
I mean, I'm quite interested. No, I'm quite interested in this kind of trend at the moment of a lot of artists making feature films, and I mean, there's a longer history. In the '80s, like Robert Longo and Cindy Sherman all made like one-off films, but the kind of impulse there wasn't the same as it is today. That was like, I'm an artist and I'm going to go make a film. Kind of like Steve McQueen did, and as Sam Taylor Wood or Sam Taylor Johnson did. Whereas I think the stuff that you're talking about is slightly different in that these are artists who are making features and conceiving of the features as a part of their practice. It's not parachuting into Hollywood, for one moment. It's really trying to do something that is sort of a part of a unified practice, but that somehow, if it's in the cinema, it will be able to reach a kind of like bigger audience. And this label of the artist feature film gets tossed around so much, and I'm really kind of fascinated by it, but I mean, I think there's sometimes the sense that it's as if filmmaking needs artists in order to be innovative or experimental, whereas there are lots of like very serious and exciting and difficult filmmakers out there, that are not necessarily working in art spaces, like someone like Miguel Gomez or something like that. But at the same time, it presumes that that there are big audiences out there for difficult films in the cinema, and I'm also not sure if that's the case. Like, there's this almost mythologization of the cinema audience as a popular audience, whereas I think it's important to remember that there are many different kinds of cinema audiences, and that the kind of audience that a Miguel Gomez film would get or Pedro Costa, it's ultimately not so different. It's probably the same people that are going to see those artist exhibitions.
Yeah, exactly. Then there is exactly like the same people. I mean, who is going to, Pedro Costa is the same, and I always thought that actually was always underestimated from the let's say the art world. A film like Psycho by Gus Van Sant, because that's really like I mean a film, a real film which had all the. Can you hear me?
There's like a buzzing. Oh, okay. It's gone now. Okay. There was a crazy buzzing noise.
Yeah, I thought it was always underestimated that,
It's a conceptual experiment.
yeah.
You know, that film. Yeah. And I think it's interesting because the art world thought, oh, that's like a conventional film remake. We're not going to think about it. But the film world, if you read within academic film studies or even like film criticism, what's been written about that film, I don't think they quite generally get it either because they're lacking the kind of like conceptual vocabulary that someone coming out of art would have. So it's almost as if it falls like between
It's an
these
orphanage.
two. Yeah. I actually think it's like super fascinating.
I once exhibited in a church when now 10 years ago. That site in front of the regional.
There's an artist who did that as a
I discovered then. But this was not a work, it was just experiencing it and how, just to underline how, and So I think we can talk forever, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think was really like fit also what is the project is, and also the fact that we decided, in the physical space, apart from this number of conversations, to have a big screen and presenting a kind of film collage, which is also kind of can be discussed this as well. What is this kind of exhibition, or like projects like exhibitions as film, as one by that Mathieu Copeland did, and so is a huge thing to discuss, and very interesting, I believe. So thank you very much, Erika.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.